I've been working on this issue for over 3 years now. I'm the chairperson of the Henry Dundas Committee of Ontario. We have a sister committee in the UK that's dealing with similar types of issues there in Edinburgh. And so what happened was, if you go back to 2020, when this whole thing started, Black Lives Matter was having demonstrations throughout the West. And people really felt motivated to want to do something. I mean, the footage of the George Floyd murder was so horrifying. And there was just like this outburst of emotion and also an outburst of compassion. And so what Toronto's response was to look at what was going on in Scotland, where there was an activist who was vilifying Henry Dundas there. And Henry Dundas was the most powerful politician in Scotland for a good 3 decades at the end of the 18th century and early 19th. And so there was his involvement in trying to end the transatlantic slave trade that was, to some people, controversial. Some people viewed it as when he tried to introduce a compromise that would actually move things forward and set a schedule for abolishing the slave trade. They thought that was him playing games and just wanting not just to delay, but to put it off indefinitely so it wouldn't happen. I looked into that. I did a lot of research. I talked to some of the most eminent historians in the world on this period of history in Scotland and Britain and the transatlantic slave trade. And while there are definitely some historians who would say that he was trying to delay it because he was trying to protect the interests of slave-holding plantation owners, many, many more said that there were enormous obstacles in front of any kind of abolition measure for the slave trade. And so a compromise was really the only thing that could work, if even that could work. Anyway, so this is what's going on in the UK. And there's an activist in Toronto who sees this and says, well, Dundas Street, is named after him. We should do something about that. So things get rolling, 14,000 signatures on a petition, and then we're off to the races with this whole renaming initiative. So that's the larger context around which this started. My own involvement is as a very distantly related family member. I'm not a direct descendant. My own ancestors came to Upper Canada in 1815. They were Scottish Presbyterians who had moved to Ireland. They were unwelcome in Ireland, and so they came here. And the Scottish Presbyterians were anti-slavery. When they came here, they joined the Wesleyan church, the Wesleyan Methodists, who were even much more activist around anti-slavery things. And so they joined this anti-slavery church and were part of a community that was welcoming in people who came on the Underground Railway or railroad in the mid-19th century. So that's my family history, and it's really part of what's motivated all of us who are on this committee who are family members and those who understand, that Henry Dundas was actually really trying to bring an end to the transatlantic slave trade or Britain's involvement in it. And as a very experienced politician, he was doing what he knew best, which was to build a coalition. I mean, still, it's not different today. If you want to have major social change and take deeply rooted social and economic structures and dismantle them, you're not going to do it overnight, right? We don't say that Stephen Guilbeault is delaying the mandatory manufacture of electronic vehicles for 12 years. He's doing a phased in approach because that's how it's going to work. It's such a massive change. And it was the same thing. Slavery and the slave trade was ubiquitous around the world and had been for centuries and more. So dismantling that was not something you could do overnight. He knew that. And he actually had what, in retrospect, and even abolitionists admitted 3 decades later, was the better plan. And they regretted that they had rejected his plan. So in the 1820s, they were going to say, oh, well, Henry Dundas, he was right after all, because they hadn't made the progress that they had hoped to make by the 1820s. And they were having to start a whole new committee or movement around abolishing slavery itself, because they had made zero progress on that level. And Henry Dundas had said, let's abolish both at the same time, because if slavery is legal, you're going to have a slave trade no matter what. People will go underground. They'll go to other countries to get slaves. And so you have to shut it all down, and you have to do it gradually. It seemed very sensible and principled to me, and fit very much with his history of being an anti-slavery person.
What's interesting here is that there seems to be some differences on how history is being perceived, how history is being understood now, well, a few centuries later. So it's interesting what you were saying too about, the electrification and the, climate issues, that what tends to happen, it seems, is that we move towards wanting this all or nothing. It's either this person is all this or none of that. And it seems that with Henry Dundas, there's in dispute, I guess, in terms of what his position was. But you in particular and your committee have found that actually there's more information, peer-reviewed research that has come to light that actually shows he was working towards abolishing slavery.
Yes. And I mean, this is what is really kind of heartbreaking about the work that we're doing, which is that, like, from the beginning, 3 years ago, we had lots of evidence to bring to bear on this that showed that he was genuinely trying to end the slave trade. It was a doable, effective plan. He had allies in the House of Lords. He had allies among the plantation owners. He had allies among the moderate abolitionists. And City of Toronto staff ignored all of that. They pretended to involve us in the process for a good 6 months, and then cut us out completely, cut out our research. And they went with the research of 2 anti-Dundas historians, one of whom had only published a commentary in a journalistic website that was very left-wing and radical and activist oriented. And the other one had a peer-reviewed article in the Scottish Historical Review. But soon after that was published, another professor came out and said there are so many errors in this, and she made some very critical statements that you rarely see from historians, saying things like, it's okay to interpret the facts differently, but you can't make up your facts, or you have to be loyal to the historical record, to the facts that have been established. And she basically took that down, or took it apart. And that historian has basically been sidelined. Like, he's been silent on this issue ever since, because he hasn't published a response. No one has defended him. So this professor who came in and did the second peer-reviewed article, in which she took apart Dr. Stephen Mullen's article, has now gone on to publish 2 more articles, both peer-reviewed, examining the very flawed process. She mostly focused on the UK and Edinburgh, and how they cut historians out of the process there. And they went with the facts that they wanted to believe, which came from a very prominent activist, a human rights activist in Edinburgh. And they cut out the historians. They cut out the one living biographer of Henry Dundas, who was originally involved there. They cut him out, and they went with an entirely political process and developed wording for a new plaque on this big monument that has a statue of Henry Dundas on top, that was so ahistorical. It was shocking. Like, even the most anti-Dundas historians would not say that plaque was accurate. That plaque assumes that Henry Dundas stood in the way of immediate abolition, so the slave trade being abolished overnight, and being effective, 100% effective everywhere in the British Empire. And so after that day, he's responsible for every single slave that was taken by British slave traders to the West Indies, the Caribbean, which is a preposterous proposition. Anyway, that's what that says. She took apart that whole process, and then she came back with a third article. This article is one where after she had spent some time in the UK archives looking at the original letters and records around this period, around what was happening, and discovered that Henry Dundas had the encouragement of some very key abolitionists, including William Dolben, who had introduced the first sort of major transformative bill in, I think it was 1788, to ameliorate the conditions of slaves. Anyway, he was a very prominent but more moderate-minded abolitionist, and they were encouraging Henry Dundas and encouraging others to support him in this. She also found correspondence that came from the slave owning interests. One letter in particular, so 2 years after this whole thing blew up in the British Parliament in 1792, this letter comes from the person who represents the slave owning interests in Britain, and says we have to shut down basically Henry Dundas's plan and William Wilberforce's plan. Like, he referred to them both as being equally abhorrent to the plantation owners, equally threatening to their economic interests. So this is after 2 years, and so the planters are still seeing Henry Dundas as their adversary on the question of abolition. If they see him as their adversary, it makes no sense for abolitionists now, or people who were sort of siding with William Wilberforce and all that at the time in 1792. Makes no sense to say that Henry Dundas was in fact defending the planters, because they didn't think he was. They were intent on shutting down his plan and blocking it entirely for gradual abolition as well. And so all of this comes together, and it really starts building more and more of a case, because, to be frank, people have not really looked at this closely in decades. And even in the 1970s, there were a number of anti-slavery historians who were doing really interesting and groundbreaking research on the slave trade and slavery. And no one really wrote a focused piece on Henry Dundas, but you can see in their writing that they assume that William Wilberforce was right when he was accusing Henry Dundas of being obstructive. They never really questioned that. And so you see a lot of references from the 1970s literature, but no one actually took it apart and said, is that true? It's like they all kind of proceeded on that assumption. Henry Dundas's biography, who had his book on Dundas published in 1993, I'm going to say, anyway, in the 1990s. He took another look at this, and he said Henry Dundas saw a problem and he was trying to solve it. And really didn't go into it much more than that, although he's written about that since then, since it became much more of a current issue. So right now is the first time in a very long time, decades, many decades, that historians are really taking a close look at Henry Dundas's role in this. And so by far now, the majority of historians are falling down on the side of it's not his fault that abolition didn't happen in 1792 or in 1796 or whatever. The slave owners, the slave traders, the House of Lords, the king, all of these huge and powerful entities that had the power to block abolition, because these powerful economic interests owned, a lot of the MPs in Parliament at that time. And then they had this economy that was founded on it. So there were, even among the populace, there was concern about this. And when the petitions came into Parliament saying that people wanted abolition, some of those petitions actually specifically said they wanted gradual abolition. And so it's not the case that it was very clear cut, even at that time.
Mm-hmm. So it seems that that there was up until 2020, and if we look at again, I always say context matters. You know, as someone who has worked in journalism, I know you worked in journalism as well as law. Often looking at things in isolation without putting the context around when decisions are being made is pretty important that we look at context. So 2020, we had the pandemic, we had the Black Lives Matter protests. So, and I know from talking, I've interviewed some people in the Indigenous community who also talk about, you know, performative like decisions or things that are happening. So, you know, it's wearing the orange shirts, you know, wanting to change the lyrics of our national anthem. And we could go on the various things as opposed to getting to the root of the issues of racism. And so what I'm hearing from you is that your background in particular is that there's sort of two issues here. It's not an issue of being, you know, wanting to support someone who was clearly racist, which doesn't seem to be the case. There seems to be a lot of gray area, and also looking at, we're talking about the 1700s.
And to be honest, not only was he not racist, there are many indications in his life that he was anti-racist. So in the 1770s, Henry Dundas represented a Black slave who had been brought to Scotland from Jamaica. He had mixed success in the lower courts with fighting for his freedom to be a free person in Scotland. And a case was going up to Scotland's highest court. So Henry Dundas came in to handle that appeal in Scotland's highest court, and for 2 years advocated on behalf of Joseph Knight. And in the end, he won a declaration, not only that Joseph Knight was a free person, but also that nobody could be a slave on Scottish soil. And he basically argued this from the principles of Scottish Presbyterianism. And he appealed to the court on those higher principles that had to do with moral questions of right and wrong. Because if he had only argued his case on the basis of the law, there was some risk there, actually. And there was a case in England, which had been much more cautious. It was the Somerset case, a similar situation of a slave wanting to be free. But the court would only say that someone who had a slave couldn't forcibly remove that person from England. In Scotland, they went much further than that. So, and Henry Dundas did that because he appealed on the basis of morality to the court, and he didn't get 100% of the judges on the court. There were 12 of them, and he had 8 on his side. But he was making legal history at that point. Another thing that we don't really talk about very much, but since this is a longer form interview, I'll mention as well that Henry Dundas had a brother who went to India, was involved in what we would call today a common law relationship with an Indian woman. They had a baby. The brother died the night before the baby was born, and the mother died a short time later. And the family was not a wealthy family. So the prospects for this child were very grim. So what happened was friends of the Dundas family basically fostered this little girl until she was old enough to be able to withstand the 2 or 3 month voyage to Scotland, where Henry Dundas and his wife adopted her. So they had 4 children. They brought this biracial child from India, born out of wedlock, into their family to protect her and make sure she had a good life. And Michael Fry, who's the biographer of Henry Dundas, would say that there were other people of mixed race or other racial backgrounds in the Dundas family, which I haven't really looked into, but that was the most personal one for him. And I've often wondered, actually, if that didn't have something to do with why he was motivated around these issues that had to do with race. One of the things that he said in Parliament, and this gets very little attention, but he was the only person who was talking about African involvement in the slave trade and how it was the Africans who were selling their own people. And what he said was that the slave owners shouldn't have any confidence that this is going to continue, because the people of Africa were capable of producing a leader who would put an end to this for humanitarian reasons and to protect the people, to protect his brethren. And so he was predicting this. So he saw African people as being capable of getting a handle on this and shutting it down themselves. The other thing is, in the archives around this whole legal case involving the slave where he represented this person, he also made a comment that said something to the effect of, the only difference between Black people and us is lack of education, lack of opportunity. Like, he basically told the court, we aren't different. We come from different circumstances, and so we have different abilities as a result of that. But that's not because of anyone being inferior. And it was actually pretty remarkable that he would be saying that in that day and age, and distinguishing his argument on that level from other people who were more like, we have to take care of the Black population. It was like, no, they can do this. They need education. They need opportunity. They need us to get out of the way and let them be who they're capable of being. So.
Well, I just want to say, as I call myself a recovering journalist, and listening to you after reading, I've been reading, trying to read on all sides, reading what the city has put forward, reading what your committee has put forward. And what's fascinating right now is, this is perfect for the topic of curiosity and curious minds, because you're bringing forth stories that haven't seemed to be in the forefront. And looking at things in isolation can lead us into a lot of problems. And that's why I said often it's so important to step back and look at the whole story, look at the big picture. And hearing about, that story alone of him welcoming that child into the family, I mean, that says a lot about someone in terms of, at that time period too. I'm sure that must have been very controversial. And, I always say you need to look at someone's character beyond only actions in isolation. You have to step back. So those are fascinating stories. And I know we're going to put some more links to some of the blogs I've been reading, and it's fascinating to see the history and the research that you've done. When I have people on this show, one of the things I try to always look at is that, how curious are they? What research have they done? And you certainly have get high marks for research and bringing forth a lot of information. Now, I want to jump ahead a little bit to where we are current day, because you've given a really good synopsis of some of the history. There's much more, and I'm finding it fascinating myself to read up about Mr. Henry Dundas. He sounds like quite an interesting person. So we're at a place now where the city of Windsor has already made a decision on this. And it's seeming, from what I've read, like any of the research you've talked about doesn't seem to come to light in the city's information gathering. But they have made a decision. And I think this is really interesting that they have decided to rename Young Dundas Square. And this is something too, I just want to bring up some kind of, because I was doing a little research. The site is owned by the city and administered by a board of management. The board of management for Young Dundas was established in 2001 as the first public-private partnership in Canada. Now, I want to go back. There was something here. Let me just find. I don't seem to have it here, but one of the interesting items too is that 2 members of the board of management resigned after this decision. Then the current board chair said they didn't resign because of the name change, but they also didn't release the letters. And I didn't see any more information on this. To anybody now, do you know? Did anybody ask them? Well, why did 2 people? I think it was the chair and vice chair. It was 2 higher level
Yes,
people
that's
resign
yeah.
from.
Mhm.
Okay. So that seems, I mean, it's kind of curious. Did anybody wonder why they left so suddenly after the name change?
There's a long history there, not really relevant to my particular involvement in this. There was already a lot of tension
Mm,
on that board, as I understand it, because the local councillor, Chris Moyes, was starting to push his own agenda on it and doing an end run around the board, right?
mm,
And my understanding is this is sort of like the last straw for the chair and vice chair, which was that Chris Moyes was the person who brought this motion into council to rename the square and didn't consult with them, didn't,
mm.
and the whole process totally eliminated the public consultation that had been promised around this stuff. And I think they were just so offended that not only was he doing more of the same, which is going around the board and not consulting with them, but he was also doing something that offended them just on the basis of respect for due process
Mhm.
and living up to honoring your promises. If you promise to do public consultation, then do it. So I think that's what that was about.
Well, interesting, because whether they agreed or disagreed, like I'm also a big fan of, consistency and following process, regardless of where you may fall on any issue, because, if you're not doing that, you can often find later those tables get turned, right? And then people get upset because if you're not following on consistently. So as far as we know, they're going to rename Young Dundas Square to Sankofa. And there's now, I also read other things that Sankofa comes with some controversy as well. So now, can you speak to that as to?
Well, yes. So, I mean, this is, again, there's a problem of due process because what Mayor Chow did was she went to that community advisory committee that was choosing a short list of names that was supposed to be put to the public for consultation and just said, pick a name and pick it tonight. And that's what we're going with. And so this was what they came up with. So there is a problem that the public was cut out of it. I mean, Sankofa is a word that comes from the Akan people in what's now the Ghana region area of West Africa. They were heavily involved in the slave trade. They built their economy and their society on it. They became very wealthy by having slaves and selling slaves. So, one of their languages, and there were several languages in this group, is where this word comes from. And there's nothing wrong with the word itself, Sankofa. And it does have this meaning of, looking back and recovering our past so that we can move forward. And in fact, the deeper meaning is it's okay to do that. Like you might be resistant to it, but it's okay to go back and recover. I see great irony in this because they're
Okay,
refusing.
I was just going to say this after our discussion. That seems to be the definition of irony, I think.
Yes. Oh, and actually, personally, I don't have a problem with that name, but my criticism is around the process.
Yeah.
So first of all, they had this new policy put in place that they voted on in 2022 that was supposed to guide this name choice and other name choices, and they just completely blew it off at the end. The other thing is that one of the guiding principles in choosing new names for Toronto streets and places and properties is that it's supposed to have some local meaning. Like that is one of the basic principles. There should be some local reference. And that this was like to say, we don't want to be naming things, keep these names of colonialists and whoever. Like we want it to be meaningful to our population. Well, it's hard to know how that word, when there is a very small Ghanaian population in Toronto, but they are far from unanimous in wanting this particular word to be used or even to have the name change. And like there were so many other options. There were names of people like Black people in history who had helped to build Toronto, and And so to cut out all of those names that had some local reference and that would have fit with the new renaming framework, and go with this name that has virtually no association with Toronto and has this additional weight, which is it's going to be a constant reminder to people. Anyone who looks into that name, is the first thing they're going to find out is it comes from the Akan people, who were among the biggest slave traders in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like putting this word that, I don't know, like I think of the names that we put on places as things that should inspire us.
Right.
You know, a person or something that happens that, you know, causes us to want to reach for something, to admire, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And we could admire this idea, but it still is just so remote from the Canadian experience in Toronto in particular.
I want to go back to this because the more I'm thinking about it and reading this, that it means reclaiming past teachings that enable us to move forward together. So to me, it would seem this would be a perfect opportunity to really do some digging, get curious. I mean, I just did a post the other day on LinkedIn talking about how in leadership and in companies, we need to embrace and encourage curiosity. We need to make that something that's celebrated. We need a lot more of it in the education system. And it seems that another approach could be, rightly or wrongly, whatever people may think about Henry Dundas, I would say right now from my research, as well as listen to you, is that there's no clear cut. There's no, for lack of a better term, smoking gun that says he was 100%, racist. He was out there, championing slavery. That doesn't seem to be the case. So I find this naming of this is almost even stranger, that city of Windsor or city of Toronto would Freudian slip there. City of Toronto would take this move. So I just leaving this up here because I'm trying to connect between, because they're almost not doing this. So they're naming it for something that they're not doing as a city. They're not moving forward together because, and they're not being, doesn't seem to be very curious.
Right. And you know what? Like it would actually be much easier to move forward together if they weren't vilifying this person who does have relevance to Canada's history, which we haven't got into, but perhaps we can. They're vilifying this person who he was part of the Scottish Enlightenment and rational thought, doing things according to science and so on. And he was trying to open up even their economy, have less barriers in place for trade and so on. As far as India goes, he was the one who said, we don't want to turn that into a colony. We don't want people going and settling and creating Scottish or English communities or British communities in India. He only wanted economic ties, and that was what he was working on. So he was a person who was helping to move his society forward from where it was in ways that we can look back and see were progressive. And yeah, so it's a shame that they have to tear down this person in order to have the change that they want. Whereas if they could be honest about that past instead of denying it and pretending it doesn't exist, I mean, I would have nothing to say really about all of this if they were telling the truth about Henry Dundas.
Yeah.
These are Toronto's assets. They can do with them, what they want. But I'm here and our committee is here because we object so strongly to them telling lies about our forebear, for one thing, but about this person who really did contribute in a very principled way in many ways. I mean, he wasn't perfect. He was in government for over 30 years. Of course, there are some things you can look at. You go, I kind of wish he hadn't done that.
Well, I'd like to find anybody who, if once we find that perfect person who does everything well, and I think that's the other, what's at issue here is if we're expecting anybody, especially in the 1700s and 1800s, on some of these topics to be perfect. I mean, it was one of the things I always look at is even now, I look back, even in my own world, my own career, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years. I mean, it's a very different culture. And what happens now versus what happened 30 years ago to me, very different. And, you have to look at things and see. And where I come from is that I look at, are things moving forward? Are we evolving? Are we making change? And I did a lot of work in my union background days in the area of human rights. And one of the things they always stressed was that it really is about education, not punishment. We need to educate people. We need to talk about some of these things and not punish people when they say something wrong or do something wrong. We have to look at how can we educate and move forward. So speaking of that, I do want to go to the next step because this is timely right now. And why we're speaking right now is that on January 25th, there is a meeting of the TTC, Toronto Transit Commission, is having a meeting. And one of the items at the city, so not only renaming Young Dundas Square, but also renaming, I think, 2 subway stations.
Yes.
Okay.
And a library.
And a library too. Okay. So another irony.
Yeah.
So renaming of these transit stations. So the TTC board will meet. Now, we now are in 2024. More information has come out. We've just spoke about this. So if you were speaking to that board, and I believe that's something that you are, or there's a move to get on the agenda. It's a week out, and I just looked on the TTC site. I didn't see it. I saw very little information about the meeting. In fact, I didn't even see it. The meeting of the last date they have is December 3rd. I don't see anything about a meeting January 25th. What's interesting here, let's just go through a couple of things that I did find on the site, because let's set the scene of the TTC. And so it says the TTC serves the people of Toronto by ensuring your transit system is reliable, safe, and prepared for the future. To that end, the board oversees matters of policy, planning TTC services, constructing, maintaining, and operating the system, and expanding services and facilities. Okay, that sounds like a pretty decent approach that the TTC should be doing. And I'm sure, I know this is not only in Toronto, many transit systems, they are really dealing with costs. And so renaming, I assume there'd be signage. There's a lot of changes, schedules. Who would be responsible to make all those changes, name changes? Do you know that?
Well, that's a really good question. And the reason I can't answer it is because this was kind of sprung on us by surprise in December. Like, we really didn't see this coming. We were preparing to participate in public consultations around this shortlist for a name. And then the alternative that was presented for this, one of the subway stations, was that Toronto Metropolitan University would simply get the naming rights to the Dundas station at Dundas and Yonge. And they would pay for the cost of the renovations that would be required to change that name. But like, in terms of all of the other costs around signage and, literature, like, pamphlets, whatever it is, where they have things printed with the names of subway stations. I don't know that anybody has done that work because it all happened so fast. It was like at the same time that they were putting together this deal with the Ford government around a bailout for their budget, and the same time they're agreeing to rename a stadium after Rob Ford. At the same time, they agree that they're going to rename the Dundas station, subway station after Toronto Metropolitan University, with the university paying for the cost of the renovations. It doesn't seem like the whole thing was thought through. It's like somehow this package came together in the space of a few days. And I mean, in every single way, like, naming that Ford Stadium, for example, that completely ignores the recommemoration framework that they passed, which was supposed to guide choices like that. So again, And just rushing things through, not doing things according to their own procedures that they've put in place that other people are expected to follow. It's happened so fast, and it's just like a fly by the seat of your pants decision. And I don't believe anyone has costed that out, or else we'd have some more information about that. And it's just all very fast and kind of vague.
Here's something else of interest I saw. It said the budget committee was dissolved effective January 2019, no longer an active committee. The mandate of the committee is currently under review. So this is all on their website, TTC. So, and I looked at, there's citizens. One of the things that it's always interesting to me is that a lot of decisions, especially at the municipal level, I did a previous show on this talking about City of Windsor and a decision made about the Roseland Golf and Curling Club. People can go check out that interview, because again, it was about going off the rails in terms of, public participation, public input, and process. And that seems to be a common thread recently in a lot of areas. And why I'm studying this on my show, Curious Minds, is that when we don't have a consistent process, that seems to be a recipe for a lot of chaos and a lot of problems. Because people, if you don't have a guidebook or a process to follow, how do we know where we're going? And it seems to me that we just have a lot more conflict.
We have a rules-based democracy. I mean, we have rules and procedures that govern our courts, that govern our parliament, provincial legislatures, city councils. These things are enshrined in law. And once they start playing fast and loose with these rules, especially when they've relied on them and made certain promises with a commitment to follow these rules going forward, and then just abandon them when it's inconvenient, what you have is just an arbitrary process, and you can't trust it. Like, I have personally lost trust in the City of Toronto administration to be honest with me and to be honest with the public about their plans going forward. And Mayor Chow as well. I mean, we had people writing to her. There were many people in Toronto who were writing to her office, and then they would forward the answers that they got from the mayor's office about public consultation. And they all said she was looking forward to hearing from the public. So over and over last summer, she was saying she would hear from the public. And so we were very reassured by that. It wasn't an off-the-cuff comment. This was clearly a position that her office had taken. And that's been the case right from the beginning of the process, long before her. Broad public consultation was promised from the earliest stages. And then staff decided, on the basis of a consultant who was a DEI consultant with very radical critical race theory perspectives on these things, and said, no, you can't talk to the public, or if you do talk to the public, it's going to be a mess. You're just going to get a lot of racists coming out of the woodwork, and it's going to be hurtful if you do that. So her job was to advise staff on how to go forward with public consultations. Instead, her advice was don't do them at all. And not only did they take her advice, they canceled the public consultations that were supposed to be starting in 2021. And they didn't tell council. They didn't tell the mayor. They didn't tell councillors. They didn't tell the public. It's just, so here we were waiting to participate again in this public consultation process. And then all of a sudden in late June 2021, the recommendation comes forward with staff, no public consultation. Here's your recommendation. We want you to go with the most extreme option of renaming everything with the name Dundas on it. And then after that, okay, so then they had a new process. They set up a community advisory committee. It was going to choose a short list of names. We'd have public consultation on these names. Again, no warning, just behind closed doors, there's decision. No, we don't want to hear from the public. We have something different in mind. And Mayor Chow, I was really kind of shocked. She said, oh, well, this committee met 19 times. I mean, at some point, you just have to make a decision. Well, was so irrelevant to the procedures that had been promised. I mean, how many meetings that committee had were totally irrelevant to the public's ability to have a say in any of this. And that was no excuse for cutting the public out of the process. That was an excuse for telling that committee, look, 19 meetings is enough. You have to give us your short list. It wasn't a reason to say, we're shutting this all down. We just want a name and we're going to go with that.
You know, what's interesting, I always say, democracy is messy and dictatorships are so much easier, right? If you can just say, thou shalt do this. And yet it's a very dangerous road to go down, because I have learned myself, like, it is when you need public consultation, that requires also leadership to make your way through, because, it's interesting. I've seen this. We're seeing it happen in the States. If you suppress, and I would say you suppress anything, it will come out somewhere else. And that seems to be what most people are missing, is that if you just shut down people and push them aside, those ideas or thoughts or views don't go away. They just go deeper and get to be, I think, an even bigger problem.
Well, yes, I think this is like one of the issues that is dividing people. I mean, it's relatively restricted to Toronto, but it is like they had an opportunity in 2020. Like, there was a lot of goodwill around this idea of renaming things. And one of the things, when I was being interviewed on Toronto radio stations in 2020, one of the things that I was saying then was, look, I mean, we're not opposed to you renaming things. It's not like the Dundas family needs to have its name on these places. We don't. We need you not to be dragging our name through the mud and telling lies about our family ancestors. And denying, like, our positive contributions to Upper Canada, even on the anti-slavery side of things. Like, this was what was so offensive, which was they were making this story up or proceeding on just a very skewed and biased account of history that was completely unfair and made people feel alienated, right? And so a lot of public outpouring came out around this whole idea, a lot of anger about catering to a specific group and showing disrespect. And not just disrespect, but telling lies about a person who was actually a good person, and vilifying that person in order to make these changes. Like, it just offended so many people. So, I mean, if they had decided, like, we're going to put up a plaque, we're going to say that we're taking this name down, Henry Dundas, even if they said, like, he had a controversial history, he tried to abolish the slave trade, but was unsuccessful, as a way to represent the Toronto of today, we want this name. I mean, I might have been there at the ribbon cutting ceremony, right? Because that if they had been honest, I mean, my own politics for most of my life have been left leaning. I would welcome an inclusive sort of symbolic thing that we could all get on board with and show solidarity, right? And be a cohesive community rather than divided by race and class and this idea. Like, there was one of the people who's been working with the city, who's a historian, she's a co-chair of the Community Advisory Committee. She was on a Toronto radio station recently saying that the people who are opposing renaming don't want to have names associated with Black history or Black people anywhere on public spaces, which is so unfair. And it's just so offensive, because that has never been our message. My whole life has been, first as a reporter and then as a Crown Prosecutor. I've been involved in fact-finding and truth-seeking processes all of my life. And I know that if you don't get your facts right, people who are affected by this process are never happy, right? Victims can be happy. Even people who are accused of crimes, they won't be happy, but they will accept their fate in a way that they don't, as long as the judge gets the facts right. If they get a fair hearing, the judge follows the law, gets the facts right, makes a decision that fits with all of that. They're not the ones who are yelling in court and banging, on the desk or something. And they're not the ones whose families are yelling at the judge. That sort of thing happens when people feel they haven't been heard. The facts are wrong and none of this is fair. And that divides people. It makes people feel alienated. But you can accept something even if it hurts you, even if it's painful. If you know it was fair and you did your best, they did their best, and, it was a just outcome. Maybe you didn't want it, but, you can live with it.
Well, it's interesting because I was just going to ask you about that, and you explained it very well, that your background is in media and then in law. So definitely two areas that are all about curiosity, all about research. And, one of the things I found myself as a reporter is that different people, when you're going gathering news, people will come back to a newsroom with maybe different perspectives. And I always said, people can go to the same event and come back with a different take on things, but usually there are some core basics that can be agreed upon. And it seems that I wanted to give that context for anybody listening, that your background is such that you do your research, and I can tell by the things that I'm reading and the committee work that you've done that there is some well-researched information. And, I've been looking, this reminds me of, I had another show talking about plastics, and, because I work in manufacturing, and the same thing, I would have been one of those people that thought, oh, plastics, bad. And then I interviewed someone by the name of Christy Armit, and he has reams of research, and, all those paper bags we get are actually worse for the environment than plastic. And it's not and again, it's not saying, oh, plastic is perfect and everything wonderful about it, but to demonize plastic is not moving us forward in terms of the environment and where we're going. And again, another complex topic. And it's interesting as I interview people on this show around curiosity, is that very seldom is there 100% that everything can be seen as one way or the other. There's often a lot more gray. And so I
think that one of the questions is good faith, right? I mean, you can go to a conference of historians and they will be vicious in, attacking other people's interpretations of events and so on. What was really going on? What was that person thinking? What was their goal? Like they're trying to reconstruct what actually happened on the basis of a historical record. And I'm not saying that we all need to get to a certain set of facts that we can all agree are correct. But if we're and our politicians are approaching this in good faith, like this is what, there's a really good reason to believe this is true. And if someone else says, yeah, but on the other hand, that is part of the fact-finding process, right? You test your facts out against others, and others will challenge them. And then you got to go take another look at what you've said and so on. That's a very healthy process. And that's where people are working together to try and figure out what the facts are, and they're doing it in good faith. What I see in some of this, and I don't know if it's the case with plastics, but I do know it's the case in terms of the history of Henry Dundas, is there are many people who are accusing him of atrocities who are not saying that in good faith, who are using this as an opportunity basically to vilify a historical figure and justify change, because that is something that feels good. Taking a villain, an evil, kind of figure, and banishing them and replacing it with something good. But the reality is it's so much more complicated. He was a good person in many ways. And if they refuse to acknowledge any of that, then I just cannot believe that they are approaching this in good faith. And in the beginning, I did. In the beginning, when I was dealing with the city on this, I thought I was building good relationships with people on the inside. I trusted them and they trusted me. And they, in my view, betrayed my trust. And because I do not believe that they were operating in good faith. They think they're doing something that's good for the city, and it's basically an ends justifies the means approach. But they have suppressed information for council. They haven't informed council at all about some of the new research, in particular, that exonerates Henry Dundas and shows that he had the support of abolitionists and that the slave owners were his enemy. They had that information. We sent it to them, and they suppressed it. You know, one of the leading professors in Toronto on the Atlantic slave trade, he wrote a book published in 2020, very sympathetic to the experience of the enslaved, and exposed some of the horrors of the transatlantic voyages and the suffering of slaves on these ships. I mean, he was part of this transatlantic historical literature that contributed to a better understanding of the experience of slavery and the slave trade. They totally ignored him because he didn't agree with them. And he is probably the leading Canadian authority on this subject. So I do not believe that they have contributed in good faith. And personally, they've lost my trust.
You know, that is also sadly where we are in many areas of our society right now, is that trust is lost in trust is lost in media, trust is lost in politics, and sadly even trust is lost in what I see as even in the justice system, that people are loss of trust. And so we have a ways to go next before we can rebuild trust, because once trust is gone, it takes a long time to rebuild that. And that will be stories for another day on Curious Minds. And I want to thank you, Jennifer, for being such a great guest in terms of your knowledge of history, in terms of your ability to explain this. It's complicated and yet it's not. What I find when we're looking at any individual is that it's easy to just vilify without looking at context and looking at the whole person. And you've brought to light some things that have certainly, of great interest to me. Just hearing the story about Henry Dundas and adopting or bringing in his niece like that to his family at that time period. And also understanding the difficulties of making change. It's often moving a ship. It takes a while. It's not a speedboat. And on the issue of abolition, the issue of slavery, it's very hard for us to understand now what it would have been happening then. So thank you again. I know you have a big, another job ahead of you in terms of talking with the TTC board. And let's maybe regroup again after we hear what the TTC board is doing. And maybe they will take some time to review this with curiosity, to review some of the research, and maybe take a stand from the issue of looking at rebuilding trust. They could really make some great strides forward by having an open discussion on this topic.
Exactly. I think they have an opportunity to kind of heal some of that divide that's happened and give people a voice who've been cut out. And I think they could the TTC could build some goodwill, and why not? They're about connecting, right? I hope they become the connectors in this conversation too.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer. And I know we'll talk again soon.
Okay. Thank you, Gail.